The LAII, as we call it, promotes and supports interdisciplinary teaching, research, and meaningful public engagement to advance the production and dissemination of knowledge about Latin America and Iberia. Latin America is designated as one of 7 priority areas of research for UNM, and we proudly contribute to both the university's intellectual community as well as global discourse through our public programming. We'd like to take a moment to recognize the traditional homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia on which UNM sits. The original peoples of New Mexico, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations, and also acknowledge our committed relationship to Indigenous peoples. And now I have the honor of introducing our speaker today. Dr. Rey Hernandez Duran is currently a professor of Spanish colonial art history in the Department of Art at UNM. Outside of his colonial art classes, he teaches arts of 19th century Mexico, Baroque art and architecture, arts of Spain, US Latinx art, African art, and museum studies. His research specializations are grounded geographically in New Spain, Mexico, and the US Southwest, and historically in the 18th and 19th centuries. His book, The Academy of San Carlos in Mexican Art History, Politics, History, and Art in 19th Century Mexico, will be followed by 2 publications, a historiography of colonial art in Mexico, circa 1855 through 1934, and a Routledge Companion to US Latinx Art, for which he was invited to serve as editor. In addition to his book projects, he's currently co-curating an exhibition of Chicano and Chicana artists who were part of the early movimiento in New Mexico from 1970 to 1980, and developing an article on Tejano artist Vincent Valdez's great-grandfather, who was a painter working in San Antonio, Texas, in the 1930s and 1940s. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hernandez Duran.
Well, buenas tardes, good afternoon. Thank you to the LAII and especially to Krista Savoca, who's not here with us today, who first extended the invitation to me to present on any projects or any aspect of the work that I'm working on right now. So it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I'm glad to see all of you join us this afternoon. And as I was mentioning a little while ago, the topic that I'm presenting on today, which looks at race, particularly in terms of how in Mexico, the image of the Indian gets transformed, it gets changed, and the image or representation of the Afro-Mexican, the Black subject, gets erased, at least from political and national representations. As I started looking at this, and the whole reason that I started looking at this is this is not my main area of research. If you look at my publications, they break down into either articles, publications on 18th century painting, or 19th century museology, museography, and historiography. But back in 2018, I was invited to participate in a symposium that was going to be held at the Courtauld Art Institute in London. The symposium was focused on race and art institutions in the 18th and 19th centuries, and they invited me to come and present on the Mexican Art Academy, the Academy of San Carlos, which is one of my areas of specialization. And I was mentioning earlier how, although I've done a lot of work on the Academy, I've never really looked at it through the lens of race and racial representation. So this was an exciting new way to kind of approach this material in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So I gave my presentation in London, where it was well received. And then when I was contacted by the LAII to give a presentation, I thought I'd revisit that research, and I expanded it. I'm adding some new introductory material to kind of set up or set the stage for the more formal presentation. So with that said, if I can, I'm going to go ahead and share screen and get the presentation started. So race and Mexican art of the late colonial and early national periods. So there we go. So for today's presentation, I've divided it into 2 parts. The first part, which is newer material that I added to this earlier work, are going to be informal remarks or observations about representations of racialized subjects in Mexico. And this is going to kind of set the scene, provide the background for the more formal research project that I have been working on, which focuses on the Academy of San Carlos from the late colonial through the early national periods. One of the things I'd like to say is at this point is that when we talk, and this is just general comments about studies that focus on race in contexts like New Spain or colonial Mexico, is that typically the focus is on racialized subjects that are considered non-white or non-Spanish. So we talk about Indians or natives, the indigenous population. We talk about the Black subject. We can talk about Asian presence or Castas, the mixtures of these various groups, et cetera. But it's equally important to keep in mind that white subjectivity, which in the colonial context is associated with the terms Criollo, Creole, or Peninsular, Spanish, is also a racial formation, and that it develops in concert with these other racial formations. So in terms of the larger conversation around race and racial representations in the colonial context, it's just as important to keep in mind that whiteness itself is a construct within the colonial context. Another thing that I try to keep in mind too is that we need to be careful not to inordinately or uncritically impose our contemporary ideas about race and ethnicity. Coming from the United States, our concepts of race and ethnicity are tied to an Anglophone US experience. And that is very different than the way race is constructed and represented in the Spanish colonial context. Okay, approaches, policies to dealing with indigenous communities is different between the Anglo-British US context and the Spanish. The experience of Blackness in the Spanish territories is different than it is, again, in the Anglo-British context. And it's just important for us just to keep in mind, if we're looking back at history, to not necessarily impose our understanding of race onto a context where these formations develop along slightly different lines. But in any case, with that said, when we talk about racialized subjects, as I mentioned, the ubiquitous focus tends to be the indigenous population. I mean, we're dealing with the Americas in the colonial period. So indigenous communities, the indigenous subject is found throughout the scholarship across disciplines. What I'd like to focus on today, for the most part, is on the Afro-Mexican or Black subjects. And this is an area that really needs a lot of work. And there's so many conversations that have been developing really recently, just over the last 2 decades. Is when I first started hearing about the Black presence in Mexico, at least from scholars. And really in recent years, kind of reflecting in part the changes and developments that we're seeing here in the United States. So with that said, I'm going to start with this quote. "We exist, we're here, we occupy this area, we have a culture, and we proudly say that we're Mexicans," end quote. This is a comment that was made by a gentleman, Bulmaro Garcia, who's an Afro-Mexican man from Costa Chica in the Pacific state of Guerrero in Mexico. And it's an excerpt taken from an article that was published just last spring, March 19, 2020 in The Guardian. That was an article by David Agren titled, "We Exist, We're Here. Afro-Mexicans Make the Census After Long Struggle for Recognition." Okay. Now, unlike Brazil, Cuba, Panama, or Colombia, Mexico is not typically a Latin American country one associates with a Black presence, and that's kind of shocking when you look at the reality. But then as I'm going to present today, we begin to understand how and why this happened. When you look at hard data, an estimated 1.3 to 2 million Mexicans who identify as negro or negra, Afro-Mexicano, Afro-Mexicana, and or Afro-descendant live in Mexico. The largest concentrations of Black Mexicans, there are Afro-Mexicans found throughout the country, but the largest concentrations of Afro-Mexicans or Black Mexicans are found in Guerrero along the Pacific coast, Oaxaca, also on the Pacific coast, in Veracruz, in the Gulf Coast. Shockingly, the 2020 Mexican census will count Afro-Mexicans for the first time in its modern history. When we look at the growing interest in the Black presence in Mexico, this interest in the Afro-Mexican experience so far seems to come primarily from 2 sources: outside of Mexico, from the US, and from Afro-Mexican communities themselves. An example of this is the work being done by a member of the faculty in the Department of Spanish at North Carolina Central University, Associate Professor Marco Polo Hernandez Cuevas, who's Afro-Mexican. In 2005, he founded the Mexican Institute of Africana Studies in Veracruz, Mexico. And his research informed an exhibition that was put together in Chicago at the National Museum of Mexican Arts, an exhibition titled The African Presence in Mexico from Yanga to the Present, which was open to the public in 2006. So they consulted with Marco Polo when they were working on this exhibition. And based on a recent interview that he gave, he mentioned that he plans on founding a Center for Afro-Hispanic Studies at his home institution in North Carolina. So we're seeing this kind of movement in terms of questions about Black subjects in Mexico, Afro-Mexicans. It's very much welcome. So there is current and growing interest in the Afro-Latin American, Afro-Mexican, US Afro-Latinx experience. Besides Brazil, Cuba, Panama, and Colombia, now we're seeing work done in Mexico, Chile, and Argentina. And most of us are probably unfamiliar with the fact that there are Black communities in these countries throughout South America, not just in the northern or coastal regions. Last year, when I attended the College Art Association conference, which was held in Chicago in 2020, I was invited to participate in the CAA Getty International Program, where they invite scholars from typically marginal countries that don't have representation at the conference, and they appoint hosts. And I was invited to serve as a host for a scholar, Jean-Arsène Yao, who's a professor at a university in the Côte d'Ivoire in West Africa. And his research is looking at the Black communities in Argentina. We had some really rich conversations, and I learned a lot about the Black presence in Argentina. Again, Argentina, another country that normally is not associated with the Black presence. A lot of the work that I've come across, sadly, is not coming out of my field, art history. Is kind of just starting to enter into the conversation. Most of the scholarship that I have found comes out of anthropology, linguistics, and history. And in terms of cultural production, what I have found is sort of scholarship looking at African influences or the Afro-Mexican cultural production in terms of music, dance, textiles, language, and culinary traditions. I mean, here at UNM in the Department of Chicana and Chicano Studies, for instance, my colleague Doris Cariaga, who is Afro-Mexican and from Veracruz, her work primarily focuses on Afro-Mexican cooking traditions and foods. So these are the primary areas where we see it. So where is art history? What about art? We're starting to see work, a kind of focus on this subject, and a recent publication is by the art historian Elena Fitzpatrick Sifford, who published the article titled Mexican Manuscripts and the First Images of Africans in the Americas, which was published in the Duke University journal Ethnohistory just 2 years ago. So we're starting to see developments, but like I said, art history, we still have to catch up. This is something that's brand new in terms of scholarly attention from art historians who look at visual and material culture. When we think about this broader question of race and art in Mexico, and focusing, as I'm doing right now, on the Black presence in the visual material record, there are 3 ways to approach this. One is African influences in Mexican art and cultural production, which is reflected in the work I was just talking about that we see coming out of anthropology and linguistics, looking at dance and music and food. The other 2 perspectives, Mexican art made by Black artists in Mexico. This is something no one has really looked at. And for the colonial period, there have been many debates and conversations about artists who, according to comments and descriptions made in the colonial documents, suggest that they're not white or Spanish. Oftentimes they might be mestizo or indigena. A couple of artists have been identified as possibly Black, so just the whole project of identifying where are the Black artists in Mexican art is something that needs to happen. It hasn't happened yet, with very few exceptions. And then the third perspective would be the Black subject in Mexican art. That is the representation of these racialized subjects. And in today's talk, I'm going to be primarily talking about that third approach. When we talk about the Black presence, the Afro-Mexican presence or the Black presence is evident. It's there. It's in the historical record. So I'm going to just briefly show you a few documents that represent or talk about the Black presence. What I'm showing you here is a folio. It's actually folio 23 from the Codex Azcatitlan, unidentified artist, unattributed. It's been given the title, The March of the Spaniards into Tenochtitlan. It's dated around 1530, pigment on paper. It's very typical of early colonial Mexican manuscript production. Some of these manuscripts document the conquest events. That's part of the history. And what's of interest here, if you look at the image, we see the Spaniards, of course, they're unmistakable, dressed in their armor. We have indigenous laborers who are carrying supplies, the tamemes. And here is Cortés, clearly identified. He's with a beard and a mustache. And next to him is Doña Marina, also known as La Malinche, who's his primary interpreter, although there were other interpreters. She's usually represented as the main interpreter. But right to Cortés's right is a man identified as Black by his skin color and his hair. And this individual has been identified as Juan Garrido. And Juan Garrido was actually born in Central Africa, in a region where the Portuguese had established trading relations with African communities in this area. And I believe it's through that connection, he wound up in Portugal, and then he went to Seville. And while he was in Seville, he converted to Catholicism. And he was a free Black man. You know, he joined the expeditions to the Americas, and based on records, documents, it looks like he arrived in the city of Santo Domingo, what today is the capital of the Dominican Republic. During this period, the island was under Spanish control and known as Hispaniola. Records show that he arrived sometime around 1502, 1503. And he was one of the conquistadors. He joined the expeditions that took over Puerto Rico, Cuba, and then he was part of the contingent that Hernán Cortés had put together. So he was one of the members of Cortés' contingent that marched into Tenochtitlan and conquered Tenochtitlan for the Spanish crown. He wound up settling in Mexico City. He married, he had children, and the historian Matthew Restall, if you're interested in reading more about Juan Garrido, look at the work of Matthew Restall. Matthew Restall notes or credits Juan Garrido with being the first person to introduce wheat farming to the Americas. He worked as a farmer and apparently grew wheat. So he's credited as being the first individual to introduce wheat farming to the Americas, living in central New Spain in the 16th century. We also have Gaspar Yanga. There's been a lot of attention on this particular figure. This is an unattributed, I couldn't find the name of the artist who constructed this sculpture. It's a public monument to Yanga that was put up around 2010 in a town called Yanga after him in the state of Veracruz, in Guerrero on the West Coast, where we see a concentration of Afro-Mexicans and Afro-Mexican communities. Gaspar Yanga was also born in Central Africa, but unlike Garrido, he was enslaved and was brought to New Spain as a slave along the coast where like the plantations were located. And he led a revolt of slaves, and he formed a settlement of free or escaped slaves, what that was known as San Lorenzo de los Negros. This is in the 16th century. And after years of conflicts between San Lorenzo, the town of escaped slaves, after years of conflict between this community and the colonial government signs a treaty. They develop a treaty with the community, recognizing it as a free town of free Blacks, which is really stunning. You know, that this is a town of free Blacks in the 16th century on the Gulf Coast of New Spain, today Mexico. And that town that he founded is the town of Yanga, where this monument is located. Interestingly, in 1871, thanks to the work of Mexican historian Palacio Riva, he was declared a hero of Mexico and the first liberator of the Americas. You know, this is really interesting. You know, I want to kind of remember what I'm talking about here. It's a very important historical figure. This is a very famous painting from the 19th century by Anacleto Escutia. It's a posthumous portrait of Vicente Ramon Guerrero Saldaña, most commonly known as Vicente Guerrero. He lived from 1782 to 1831. He was one of the heroes of Mexican independence. This is a posthumous painting, so it was produced sometime around 1850. The date's a little hazy, oil on canvas. And although although his racial identity hasn't been entirely confirmed, descriptions by his contemporaries describe his darker skin and his hair. And then you look at this painting, and it's generally accepted that he was mixed with some Black derivation or Black background. And he was one of the leaders of the Mexican independence movement. He joins the army, Jose Maria Morelos. He becomes a commander-in-chief of the rebel troops. And it's believed that he convinces Agustin de Iturbide. Agustin de Iturbide was an upper-class Creole who was on the Spanish side of the battle. He was a royalist. And it's believed that it was Vicente Guerrero that convinced Agustin de Iturbide to leave his royalist tendencies and join the insurgents, which Agustin de Iturbide did. So together they allied and formed the Army of the Three Guarantees under the guidance of the Plan de Iguala. This was a plan that they had set up for the new independent nation. And one of the principles of the Plan de Iguala was to abolish the racialized sistema de castas that had dominated during the colonial period. Of course, Agustin de Iturbide, shortly after Mexico declares its independence, is appointed the first leader of independent Mexico. He's the emperor of an independent Mexico. He eventually is deposed and executed. Guerrero is one of the people that stands up against Iturbide. It's a very chaotic period in terms of the history of Mexican leadership. Guerrero is elected president in 1828, but then he only lasts a year before he's deposed and then executed. But while he's president, one of the things that the Mexican government does in 1829 is they abolish slavery in Mexico. Very interesting conversation there about the abolishing of slavery and then what happens just a few years later in Texas, something that sets up the Civil War in the US, actually. Now, if we talk about the Black subject in the visual culture, so we just looked at a few Black or Afro-Mexican historical figures. If we talk about the Black subject in visual culture, there are a couple of examples that I pulled up. Of course, when we talk about the colonial period, the go-tos are pinturas de casta. And I feel that a lot of people misunderstand or misrepresent pinturas de casta. You can't use these paintings as documents to illustrate race, and that's not what they are. Okay, they are highly mediated and don't talk about demographics as much as the dilution of Spanish blood and all of the assumptions related to character entailed by that dilution of Spanish blood. Okay, I could go and give a whole lecture on pinturas de casta. It's one of my areas of expertise, but I need to get the show on the road. So I just wanted to show you that in terms of the colonial period, this is one of the areas in terms of visual culture art where we see Black subjects. And pinturas de casta, I'm assuming most, if not all people have some familiarity with this, but typically they represent the racial mixtures between what are considered to be the three parent groups of New Spain. That is the white Spaniard, the indigenous, and the African. And that already is sort of cluing us in that the Black presence is recognized, okay, in the colonial period. And I'm showing you on the left, Casta paintings take one of two forms. They're usually they show 16 racial mixtures, and one format is all 16 mixtures on one canvas, like a taxonomy, like a chart, which is what we're seeing on the left. If you have the money and the space, you commission an artist to paint separate portraits for each of these mixtures. So the image on the left is unidentified, it's anonymous, 18th century, but the one on the right is by the famous 18th century painter Miguel Cabrera. And, there's writing all over everything. In the colonial period, text is just as important as images. And the Casta paintings have text to identify what it is you're looking at. It says de español y de negra mulata, from a Spaniard and a Black woman, a mulata child. And it's numbered number 4. So this tells us that this is the 4th panel in a series, probably of 16. We only have a few that survive. Not all of them are intact. And these are primarily found in Spain. So pinturas de casta. When we look at the 19th century, I'm going to talk about these in my presentation shortly, we have the influence of costumbrismo. This is like genre painting, the depiction of ethnic types or racial types. This is something that's been happening in Europe for the last 2 centuries, and it's introduced by European artists to Mexico after independence. After Mexico declares its independence and the borders open up, there's a lot of curiosity about the Americas. You have tourists, visitors flooding in from Europe, Britain, France, Germany, from the US, wanting to explore and see what Mexico is all about. And some of these visitors are artists, as well as natural scientists and illustrators. And these European artists document, they're very interested in the local landscape, the local flora and fauna, on the archaeological remains of ancient civilizations, and they're interested in local ethnic Mexican types. So Mexican artists who really weren't representing the world around them quite yet see what these European artists are doing, and then they get inspired to paint the people in the world around them, which leads us to the development of pintura costumbrista. And one of the leading artists is Jose Agustin Arrieta, who produced numerous costumbrista paintings. A couple of years ago, this painting on the right, which is El Costeño, boy from the coast, an Afro-Mexican boy from the coast, probably the Pacific coast. This painting was here in Albuquerque. It was on view at the Albuquerque Museum. There was a show of Spanish art coming from the Hispanic Society of Americas in New York. They were remodeling their building, and they're very smart. They're like, we have to take everything out to remodel, so let's make some money off our collection. So they toured it, and you have to pay to bring it. And the Albuquerque Museum brought the show, and it was mostly Spanish art, but they had a gallery of colonial art and Mexican art. And this is one of the paintings that was in the show. Spectacular painting, again, that evinces the presence of Afro-Mexicans. And a figure that is not Mexican or Novo Hispanic, but Peruvian, is, of course, San Martín de Porres. And if we're talking about the Black presence in Mexican visual culture, I grew up with, my mother had an avocation for San Martín de Porres. He's a Black saint from Lima, Peru. He lived during the colonial period. He was a lay brother of the Dominican order. He gets beatified in 1837 and then canonized in 1962. And his image is everywhere in Mexico. Like I said, I grew up with an image of San Martín de Porres in my home on my mother's altar. So even though he's not Mexican, his image proliferates and is part of Mexican visual culture. Moving outside of art to movies and television and music, a major figure that stands out that I grew up with as well, my father was a musician, was Antonia del Carmen Peregrino Alvarez, known as Doña La Negra. She lived from 1912 to 1982. I think most of us of a certain age are familiar with her music. You know, she was born in Veracruz, where we have a concentration of Afro-Mexican communities. And she worked from 1932 up until 1982. She was a singer. She recorded numerous records, but she also appeared in movies. And she collaborated quite actively with the famous Mexican singer, composer, actor, Agustin Lara. Again, in her name, she's identified as Black in her name, and she was one of the most famous performers in Mexico in the mid-20th century. If we're talking about popular culture, we have to talk about movies and comics, and this is where we run into stereotypes and racist imagery. When I was really little in San Antonio, Texas, my mother, who was Mexican, would take me downtown to this beautiful theater called the Alameda Theater. That was one of these theaters constructed in the 30s with very elaborate architecture. It had a ceiling with moving clouds. I loved that when I was a little kid, but that became the theater for the Mexicans. You know, we had our own parts of downtown. So when I was little, my mother would take me to the Alameda because they would show Mexican movies from the golden age of Mexican cinema. And that was where I first saw Angelitos Negros, which was produced in 1948. And it starred another iconic Mexican actor, singer Pedro Infante. Angelitos Negros, in brief, is about this a light-skinned, upper-class Mexican young woman who marries a boy from the right family. She gets pregnant. Everybody is happy for them. Her mother apparently died in childbirth, so she was raised by her Black nanny, okay, and her father. And when she gives birth, this is like a white Mexican girl, gives birth to a Black baby, and all hell breaks loose. Okay, she rejects the child. Of course, this is Mexican cinema from the mid 20th century. There's a moral. She discovers that her mother was actually the Black nanny. Her white father had an affair with the Black nanny, and her mother was not the white wife that had killed herself. It was her nanny all along. So by the end of the movie, she comes to accept her Black mother and her child. So it has like a moral to it. But again, here we could talk about blackface, in that no Black actors were hired to work on this. There were mestizos and criollos who were hired and painted to look Black. And then, of course, a comic book character that is incredibly popular, not just in Mexico, but throughout Latin America, Memín Pinguín. It was created in 1943 by Yolanda Vargas Dulce and Sixto Valencia Burgos. It appeared for years in a magazine titled Pepín. There were multiple editions of this, and the latest one was just in 2004, which is very, very recent. Again, we're talking about racist caricature, offensive imagery, and the fact that these are so popular, many Mexicans don't see anything wrong with this. They see racism, the way we understand it, as a gringo or US thing. They're so desensitized to this kind of imagery that it's become naturalized to them. But that has a lot to do with the social structure that they grow up in, which has colonial roots. This is one of the things that is sort of indirectly related to what I'm talking about today. If we're talking about racial stereotypes, I have to talk about La India Maria, one of the most popular and entertaining indigenous images in film. Maria Nicolasa Cruz, known as La India Maria, Indian Mary, was played by the actress Maria Elena Velasco from 1972 to 2015. She first appeared in the movie Tonta, Tonta, Pero No Tanto, 1972. She's appeared in 16 films, and including a TV series, a short-lived TV series. And her last appearance was in a movie called La Hija de Moctezuma in 2014. She passed away the year after that. But this is another popular cultural Mexican icon that is beloved by people, but that really is based on some really offensive caricatures, not just indigenous people, but indigenous women particularly. Going back to the question of Black artists in Mexican art history, this is where we have to have a lot of work done. There's not been anything. One artist in the colonial period that we know was Black was Juan Correa, and he's one of the superstars. Juan Correa was one of the superstar painters in late 17th century Mexico City. He's a colleague of Cristóbal de Villalpando, who's really well known. This is a work by Juan Correa. It's a biombo, which is a mixed media construction. It's a freestanding multi-panel screen that is inspired by Japanese byobo screens. Both sides are painted. These would have been found in elite homes. This particular biombo has sort of a science didactic subject. On this side, it's the liberal arts. And on the other side are the four elements. A beautiful, beautiful object that is a result of trade with Asia and the circulation of Asian goods throughout the Americas. This is one of the artists that we know was Black. His father has been identified as a mulatto physician from Spain. He was a free Black man from Spain who migrated to New Spain, where he met his mother, who was a free Black woman in Mexico named Pascuala de Santoyo. This is something that I'm going to talk about in my more formal presentation coming up, and that is the presence and growing community of free Blacks. Not all Blacks in Mexico were enslaved. Many were, but many were also free. And that has to do with the law coming out of medieval Spain. This is why I was saying, when we talk about constructions of race and racialized representations, we can't impose our views as they form in the US, because the Spanish or Latin American world is very, very different. So when it comes, one thing that you should be noticing is when it comes to questions of race and the recognition of Black communities in Mexico, there is a distinction between official or national discourse and popular culture. The Black presence in Mexico wasn't entirely erased, but it was relegated to very specific pockets of cultural production. Okay, we see images of Afro-Mexicans in popular culture. However, in official representations of Mexican history and Mexican national identity, that's where the Black presence has been removed. So it's important to make that distinction. is that the Black presence hasn't been completely erased. It's there in popular cultural forms. It's in official national representations where we see the absence of the Afro-Mexican presence. Hence the surprise that it's the 2020 Mexican census that will be the first time Afro-Mexicans are recognized. And there's a history to this. There's a reason I'm going to talk about. So the erasure or marginalization of the Black Mexican presence in official national historical identity occurred in phases. It didn't all just happen at once. It starts in the late 18th century into the early 19th century, and then we run into questions of race and racial definitions in the early 20th century up to the present. And here we can have a whole conversation as well about the Mexican Revolution, the indigenismo movements, La Raza Cósmica by José Vasconcelos. That's a whole other conversation that contributes to the marginalization, if not erasure, of Afro-Mexicans. But my talk now, I'm going to shift gears. I wanted to kind of set the stage for you. So this work that I've been doing can be considered a step in sort of fleshing out that much longer history that contributed to the eventual erasure or marginalization of the Afro-Mexican presence in official national discourse. So this is where I'm going to get kind of scholarly and academic, because I'm going to be reading my paper. So the first art academy in the Americas, the Academia de San Carlos in Mexico City, was chartered in 1781 following a petition by the Spanish official Jerónimo Antonio Gil, who had been royally appointed head engraver of the mint in the viceregal capital. The petition was approved by the viceroy, Martín de Mayorga, and later confirmed by the king in 1783, following the arrival of the incoming viceroy, Matías de Galvez, who we see here on the right, who acted as patron of the newly established academy. Now, for this part of the presentation, and with the objective of examining how the image of the Indian was transformed and of the Black erased, I focus on the late colonial, early national period. So we can roughly think about 1750 to 1850, a 100-year range that begins with the decline of Spanish colonial rule in the Americas and ends with the first 3 decades of independent Mexico. The transition from Spanish viceroyalty to modern nation was turbulent and destabilized the region economically and politically for decades. The United States invasion of Mexico in 1847 and the subsequent annexation of the northern half of Mexican territory in 1848 further debilitated the struggling nation. Examining the relationship between race and the Art Academy during this period reveals how institutional practices reflected first imperial and later national political ideologies and attitudes towards Mexico's local unique racial diversity. But first, some historical background to set the scene. When in 1519, Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés first set foot on the eastern Gulf shore of what today is Mexico, it is estimated that approximately 25 million natives inhabited the region. A year later, in 1520, an epidemic of smallpox introduced by the recent arrivals quickly spread among the indigenous population, which went from 25.2 million in 1519 to 1.2 million by 1620. So just in a century span, over 24 million natives perish as a result of exposure to this disease. However, in the mid-17th century, the native population gradually began to recover. Some historians estimate that by the 19th century, the indigenous population had reached pre-conquest numbers. So eventually the indigenous population does recover. A decade after the conquest of Mexico, the Spanish crown decided to implement a viceregal system in the Americas as it had done in parts of Europe. At this point, Spain governed various regions in Italy and various regions in Northern Europe, what were Spanish viceroyalties or viceregal territories. It's a very successful system in terms of governing lands that are far away from the capital and the government. Because it was such a successful system, the Spanish crown decided to implement a viceregal system in the Americas. The objective was to strengthen the crown's authority in the empire's distant territories, in part by improving oversight. With the arrival of the first viceroy, Antonio de Mendoza, and the gradual pacification and restructuring of the territory that followed, the migration of Iberians to central New Spain grew. With the increased presence of Spanish women, a new social class began to emerge, the criollos or Creoles, many of who, not all, most of them were poor, but many of who racially identified as white came to form a new aristocracy in the developing social hierarchy. So from approximately 1545 through 1600, the movement of diverse peoples across the Atlantic and the Pacific to the Americas increased. The trade route between New Spain and the Philippines, established in 1565, facilitated the movement via the Manilan galleon, not just of goods, luxury materials, and food, but also of Asian migrants from the Philippines, Japan, China, and possibly even India. There are suggestions in colonial documents that there may have been people from India, what today we call India, in Mexico during this time. Given the significant loss of native life due to disease and physical abuse, the need for a new source of labor became urgent. The importation of enslaved Africans to the Spanish American territories began in 1501, but it was in 1518 that the Spanish crown approved the importation of slaves directly from Africa, initially via Portuguese traders and later via British traders, officially initiating the slave trade with Spain and its American territories. So between 1519 and 1580, approximately 36,500 enslaved Africans are estimated to have been taken to New Spain, with the height of the slave trade occurring between 1580 and 1640, and the estimated Black population in New Spain in 1650 at 140,000. However, given the Spanish legislative code known as the Siete Partidas, which provided avenues for the manumission of slaves, Mexico's population of free Blacks grew considerably throughout the 18th century. By 1821, when Mexico declared its independence from Spain, 3,000 Blacks were enslaved, with the majority of individuals of African descent living as free people. It is estimated that in its 300-year colonial period, approximately 200,000 enslaved Africans were taken to Mexico. And it's important to understand here that the Black presence in Mexico isn't just a result of enslavement or the slave trade. Remember that there were Blacks coming with the Spanish. You know, Spain's history, the Moorish occupation of Spain for 800 years. These are North Africans who were dominating on the Iberian Peninsula. So Spain has a very, very long history of an African presence, on the peninsula, which makes it very different from the rest of Europe. Okay, so when the Spanish started coming via expeditions to the Americas, they were Black individuals accompanying the conquistadors, like Juan Garrido, who we've already talked about. And then, of course, then you have the importation of enslaved Africans. And then much later, then you have people migrating to modern Mexico. I just kind of want to point that out, that the Black presence is also informed in part historically by Blacks that were coming from Spain. All right. By 1600, New Spain was home to a diverse population consisting of a mostly rural majority native or indigenous demographic, itself diverse ethnically and culturally, a growing, primarily urban white Creole population, a small but diverse Asian presence, a small but growing, also primarily urban Black community, mostly slaves, but also including free Blacks, and an increasing stream of peninsulares from Spain. These are the Spanish coming, migrating from the Iberian Peninsula. Throughout the 17th century and into the 18th, the castas, or castes, mixtures of European and Indian, European and Black, and Indian and Black, and on and so forth, increased exponentially. Following the death in 1700 of the last Spanish Habsburg, Charles II, the newly installed Bourbon monarchy found itself inheriting a bankrupt global empire that was facing external threats and various internecine conflicts. In the Americas, Bourbon officials encountered a vast territory populated by large urban centers spread across thousands of miles and inhabited by pluralistic societies where racial mixing was the norm, especially among the larger population. From the French Bourbon perspective, corruption, inefficiency, and lack of adequate oversight during the preceding Habsburg period had resulted in significant economic losses and lack of adequate regulation. The Bourbons, critical of how the Habsburgs had mismanaged Spain's vast empire, sought to strengthen imperial authority, to restructure the territories, to fortify the empire's defenses, primarily in the provinces, and to increase efficiency and productivity. The policies that were implemented to actualize these changes, collectively known as the Bourbon Reforms, although motivated by economic and political concerns, extended to the cultural sphere, which implicated the arts, given the arts' utility in terms of generating tax revenue, circulating imperial propaganda, and actualizing the crown's civilizing and modernizing objectives. Bourbon officials throughout the 18th century were critical of what they found in the American territories. Among the various concerns, and those relevant to this talk, were the rampant miscegenation, in particular with Blacks, encountered throughout the viceregal territory, and also what they perceived as a lack of stylistic uniformity and quality in local art production, which they believe was due to the distance of the American viceroyalties from European cultural centers. The Bourbon crown was supportive of indigenous rights and privileges. This interest in improving the standing of natives is exemplified, for example, by the awarding of scholarships to eligible native youths for whom several places were reserved at the new Academy of San Carlos. The same, however, did not apply to Blacks. For example, in 1778, the colonial government implemented a law known as the Royal Pragmatic or the Pragmatic Sanction, which gave parents legal authority to prevent the marriage of their children if there was substantial social inequality between them and their chosen partners, a law that effectively impeded racial mixing with Blacks. Given the proliferation of workshops led by artists of varying backgrounds, training, and skill, colonial art production was diverse in style and quality, something that the Bourbons judged to be inferior, a sign of decadence, and a result of the lack of proper institutional controls. For example, in 1799, various artists working, these are Creole artists working in Mexico City, filed a petition, a grievance with the viceroy, complaining that there were too many untrained artists. And they're talking about artists who were indigenous, mestizo, mulatto, and Blacks, including poor Spanish artists who were untrained and selling art. They're trying to get rid of competition. So the artists affiliated with the academy appealed to the viceroy to make it illegal for these artists who were working outside of the academy. And, it was primarily Creoles and Peninsulars, whites, who were allowed in the academy, with the few native students who were allowed in. When they're trying to pass a law to prohibit or make it illegal for artists not affiliated with the academy to sell art, they're primarily targeting artists of color, who had never been let into the academy, but were making a living. Yeah, and they were also wanting to get rid of competition because based on records, one of the complaints is that people do a lot of business with them, and one of the complaints was that because they're not trained, they are producing sacrilegious religious images. They don't know how to properly paint religious images. So that's an interesting kind of complaint that kind of underlines some of the politics, the racialized politics I'm talking about here. As the 18th century proceeded, the exuberant and highly ornamental churrigueresco style that had been introduced and promoted by the Bourbons fell out of favor as the more restrained neoclassical aesthetic to hold in Spain. The Academy of San Carlos, founded by Peninsular petition, was meant to be a tool with which the Bourbon crown could implement programs at civilizing or modernizing its American territories. Okay, in other words, this kind of highly ornamental churrigueresco late Baroque style was seen as bad taste, as out of date, as obsolete. And they wanted to modernize or update the American territories via the Academy by removing these older Baroque altarpieces and replacing them with the more austere neoclassical style altarpieces that you see exemplified in the right image. These objectives included centralizing arts education and artistic training in one institution. Significantly, given that the Academy was founded during a period of revolutions and growing American unrest, San Carlos was also seen as a mechanism the Bourbon government could use to disseminate pro-monarchy propaganda in an attempt to diffuse increasing hostility towards Spain and its colonial government. In light of these objectives and other Bourbon concerns, local culture, local politics were not the focus of the academic institution and its artistic production. Instruction at the Academy of San Carlos promoted a more rigorous emphasis on classical models and drawing focused on the copying of prints, on studies made after plaster reproductions of classical and Renaissance sculpture, and on drawing from life. Painting followed the practice of European academies with a focus on academic history painting, portraiture, and still life painting, although in New Spain, religious subjects continued to comprise a major part of academic art production. The subject matter across media and genres, including sculpture and printmaking, was overwhelmingly classical, with prints and public monuments often employed to disseminate imperial imagery. Representations that referenced daily subjects or that gave form to local racial realities were absent from academic art of the late colonial period, with one notable exception. A major commission of the Spanish instructor of painting, Rafael Jimeno y Planes, who you see here on the left, was his painting, El Milagro del Pocito, which you see to the right. The painting, intended for the chapel of the Palacio de Minería, depicts in an academic history format one of the miracles tied to the story of the apparition of the Virgen de Guadalupe to the Indian Juan Diego in 1531. So here's an image of the palace. That's a mining palace. It's about engineering and mining. And then on the right is a photograph of a chapel that's in the palace. And Jimeno y Planes' canvases are on the roof. They were intended to be installed in the ceiling. In the painting, three figural groups inhabit a rocky landscape. The main group is centered on the figure of Juan de Zumárraga, the first Archbishop of Mexico, who points to a fountain of water that has miraculously appeared from a stone. He is flanked by religious officials, a group of peninsulars or Creoles, and a figure on horseback. Kneeling to the Archbishop's immediate right is Juan Diego. To the right, we see a group of natives gathered next to a tree, but it's the figural group to the left that is of interest. Standing on a wagon is a white male figure who faces away from us and looks directly at Zumárraga. The figure raises his arm in response to the Archbishop, who is addressing him. Seated on the wagon directly behind the standing figure is a darker-skinned individual, possibly indigenous, who rests his foot on the back of a black man lying on the ground, partially beneath the wagon. Now, this is an interesting kind of thing to add to an image of the apparition because it's so anomalous. There was no Casta system in the 1530s yet, okay? And the Castas don't really have anything to do with the story of the apparition. So the fact that he integrated clearly a hierarchy here, white, native, and black, brings to mind this, okay? The racial content and the hierarchical arrangement appear to reference the caste system of New Spain, particularly as codified in Pinturas de Casta. A genre of 18th century painting, the Pinturas de Casta depicts the results of the mixing between Spaniards, Indians, and Blacks. A popular subject, Casta paintings gave visual form to the racial dynamics unique to central New Spain, seen by Bourbon officials as a curiosity at best, and definitely as detrimental to the social and cultural integrity of the viceroyalty. As a genre of painting, Pinturas de Casta did not correspond to the types of subjects that were recognized by and promoted by the Academy. I mean, the Academy doesn't teach Casta painting. That is not a recognized subject, given their interest in promoting imperial ideas and these grand subjects that are historical and religious. The production of Pinturas de Casta not coincidentally diminished and ultimately disappeared once the Academy was founded. Jimeno y Planes' inclusion of a racialized Casta reference in this painting of one of Mexico's foundational myths, a narrative tied to a religious icon that had taken on political symbolism during this period, has led certain scholars to suggest that this painting could be read as privileging or monumentalizing the Creole, possibly signaling Jimeno y Planes' support of Mexico independence. The independence movement in Mexico began in 1810 when the Creole priest Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla mobilized rural indigenous communities and led the first rebellion against the peninsular presence in New Spain. The movement culminated in 1821 when Mexican military leaders declared Mexico's official independence from Spain. After 1821, the Mexican government passed two important laws that we have briefly mentioned in the intro. The first law, approved in 1822, prohibited the identification of Mexican citizens by racial status in any official documents or official representations. That became a law in 1822. Remember what I said early on, that under the Plan of Iguala, under the leadership of Agustín de Iturbide and Guerrero, one of the goals was to abolish the racialized sistema de castas from the colonial period. So they passed this law in 1822, making it illegal to identify a Mexican citizen by race. Okay, it's very important. And the second law that is important for this conversation was proposed in 1829 by Mexico's first Black president, Vicente Guerrero, which abolished slavery, as we've already noted. The first law was proposed as a way of countering the hierarchical caste system identified with Spanish colonialism and reflected an interest in promoting the idea that all inhabitants of Mexico were equal citizens. Now, while these political developments were unfolding, Mexico was in dire economic circumstances. The country's bankrupt status rippled throughout Mexican society and came to affect the academy. During this period, circa 1822 to 1835, enrollments decreased and faculty salaries disappeared, causing the academy to shut its doors for a period of time. From 1826 to 1834, the Mexican sculptor Pedro Patiño Ixtolinque, who had been a professor of sculpture at the academy, served as the institution's director. Of indigenous heritage, he had been awarded one of the scholarships reserved for indigenous students at the academy prior to independence. During his time as head of the academy, Patiño Ixtolinque produced two of his most well-known works, which were intended for a funerary monument dedicated to José María Morelos, another Afro-Mexican hero of the independence movement. The sculptures, which were to frame the entrance to the tomb, were titled Liberty, Libertad, and America. America, which you see on the right, is an allegorical representation of the American continent. Neoclassical in form, the figure wears symbolic objects associated with American indigeneity, such as the feathered headdress and a quiver filled with arrows. Representations of living and or culturally accurate indigenous figures were absent in the art production of the academy during this time. When a visual reference to an Indian is found, as seen here, it is either allegorical and symbolic, or it's idealized and historical. Okay, so the current contemporary Indians erased from representation. Instead, the image of the Indian becomes a symbol. It's either allegorical or it's historical. During the period that the Academy of San Carlos was shut down, European and American visitors to Mexico City noted the deplorable state of the Academy and lamented the absence of a national art museum. Mexican President Antonio López de Santana, yes, that's Santana, although he's vilified historically, he actually did a couple of things that weren't that bad. You know, thanks to him, art museums were founded and art history started. You know, Mexican President Antonio López de Santana, concerned that this observation reflected badly on Mexico, requested the construction of a gallery of Mexican national art, initiating the Academy's remodeling and eventual reopening in 1846. As San Carlos was being refurbished and expanded, a search was conducted in Europe for new faculty. So even though it's independent Mexico, they're reopening the Academy, they're still looking at Europe as a model, and they want to hire European artists to teach Mexican students. Two of the hires included the Spanish painter Pelegrín Clavé and the sculptor Manuel Pilar. Now, Pelegrín Clavé, who we see here on the left, had traveled to Rome as a student, as students normally did. You always go to Rome to study for a period of time. And it was in Rome that he encountered the Nazarene movement. The Nazarenes were a group of primarily Austrian artists led by Johann Friedrich Overbeck, who looked back at the religious art of the medieval and Renaissance period, which they emulated in their own work. Arriving in Mexico City in 1846, just as the Academy was to reopen, Clavé primarily focused on history and religious painting and on promoting the Nazarene principles he had learned in Rome. So he arrives as the new professor of painting, and what does he promote? Religious painting, which reflects his interest, which is based on the Nazarene training he got in Rome. From 1846 through the 1850s, much of the painting and sculpture produced by the Academy faculty and students were either historical or religious in nature, the latter primarily drawn from the Old Testament. So what we're seeing here in terms of history, the history paintings tend to focus on Columbus and Ferdinand and Isabella, the beginning of empire, or they're religious, primarily from the Old Testament, like we're seeing here on the right. Race was nowhere to be found. As had been the case before, images of natives were either historical or allegorical, or the subjects were religious. References to Blacks or other racial groups in academic instruction and art production were absent. Okay. Representations of race and racial types by the mid-19th century were widely produced, but as was the case with 18th century pinturas de casta, they circulated outside of the Academy in the forms of costumbrista imagery. Inspired by European artists such as Carl Nebel, who traveled to Mexico after 1821 and expressed interest in the natural landscape, the local culture, and ethnic types, non-academic Mexican artists began to paint the world around them, starting in the 1830s. So let's look at Arrieta. The scenes of daily life painted by costumbrista artists did not reflect or cohere with the types of subjects taught or promoted by the Academy of San Carlos. The focus on daily life and ethnic types was considered inferior to the grand historical and religious themes that were the focus of the work of Academy faculty and students. So the Academy represents the official artistic arm of the government, and they're emulating European institutions. So they're copying what European institutions are doing, and European academic institutions aren't producing artworks, looking at the local environment. They're producing historical subjects, religious subjects, and they're promoting sort of imperial or nationalistic imagery. So in conclusion, I'm going to wrap this up. A preliminary survey of the intersections of race in the Academy of San Carlos from roughly 1750 to 1850 indicates that the Academy actively avoided racial representations during the first century of its existence, but for different reasons. In the late viceregal period, the Academy functioned as a branch of the Spanish imperial government and was founded specifically to introduce the neoclassical idiom and its ideas to the American territories in an attempt to civilize and modernize American viceregal cities and their inhabitants. So if the intent is to modernize, these distant territories, there would be no interest in this kind of local subject that we see in Pinturas de Casta. Given the academic principles that were deployed, local subjects were not of interest since they did not correspond to or reinforce imperial objectives. After the independence movement, new objectives tied to nation formation shifted the focus of academic subject matter, but still within a neoclassical vocabulary. The only racialized presence is of the Indian as a palatable, abstracted symbol of the nation's past. When the Academy reopened in the mid-19th century, the background and interests of its European faculty, in tandem with the current politics in the capital, specifically conservative politics, promoted history painting and religious images in academic art production. In both cases, the late colonial and the early national, depictions of race were of interest, but they were produced and circulated independently of the Academy. Again, they're produced more in the popular cultural realm, not in the official institutional spaces. Okay. As a former colonial territory, Mexico found itself in a predicament. Through its institutions, it aimed to emulate European models as a demonstration to the rest of the world of its accomplishments and worthiness. However, its history, cultural forms, and its inhabitants were not European. How to negotiate its racial realities became a challenge, one that its institutions avoided, but that artists working outside of the limits imposed by those very same institutions tackled head on. After 1850 and into the 1870s, this process of transformation and erasure continues, and it culminates in the early 20th century with the recentering of the Indian subject in national discourse in response to the indigenismo movement with the concomitant promotion of mestizaje as the mythologized foundation of modern Mexican national identity. But again, that's another paper. And I'm going to go ahead and conclude here and take any questions you may have.